This is Barry O'Carroll from the Europe Direct Information Centre at Blanchardstown Library, and I'm back with another interview in our series on education and employment opportunities for young people. Now, today I'm joined by Joe O'Connor, who's the Director of Campaigning with the union Forsa. So, hello, Joe.
Hi, Barry. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thanks for joining me. And you're going to talk a little bit about growth careers, obviously to see kind of what's coming down the road in the next few years. What are the careers that are going to be really sought after, I think, and where, you know, employers are going to need skilled people. First of all, could you just tell me a little bit about your role at Forsa?
Sure. Well, for maybe some of your listeners that wouldn't be aware of Forsa, Forsa is the largest public service union in Ireland. We're the second largest general union. We have 80,000 members, most of whom are in the public and civil service, so working in enterprises such as health service, the local authority sector, the civil service, and then we also have some members in the private sector, such as aviation, communications, and so on. So my role is as Director of Campaigning, so I would coordinate the union's national campaigning efforts. So a lot of the work would be, I suppose, our engagement with the political system and some of the public campaigns that we would run. So a lot of issues that would affect our members, I suppose, outside of the workplace. So actually a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about this afternoon around the future of work would be quite relevant to some of the work that I would do.
Brilliant. So let's get straight into it. What do you see as being growth careers in the future? What kind of areas are we looking at? We often think of maybe climate science, various digital industries and services. Anything you could add to that, or would you agree with that?
I think that the questioner was quite pertinent in terms of the areas that they identified, because I suppose we're dealing with two major economic and societal transformations which are coming together at once. One of which is the transition to a low carbon economy, and over the next 10 years or so, major targets between now and 2030, which will obviously see quite a lot of displacement of high carbon industries, and obviously the potential for the creation of lots of new green jobs in green energy and green industries. And the second then is what's often called the fourth industrial revolution, which is around digitalization, digital technologies, the digital economy. And a lot of that will see, again, displacement of work which is maybe easily automated by digital technology, but also the creation of a lot of jobs in kind of managing those technologies and so on. So in preparing for this, I took a quick look at the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report in 2018, which I'd encourage people to take a look at. A lot of really interesting data. And I suppose one of the key observations I'd have from that is that a lot of people, I suppose, fear these transitions because the focus is often on the jobs that we may lose. But I mean, this isn't the first major industrial shift that we've had in the global economy. We've seen that at various different stages of development. And generally what tends to happen is that the jobs that are displaced are often replaced by not only more jobs, but in many cases better quality jobs. So they estimate that in a 5-year period that we're going to see 75 million jobs displaced, but 133 million jobs created. Wow. So that would suggest that in areas, and some of the areas that they would see would include data and artificial intelligence, engineering and cloud computing, product development, and then obviously opportunities in the green economy, and also in the caring economy, which I'd like to talk a little bit further about maybe later on. But that's kind of the overview that they have in terms of growth sectors. The other thing I'd say is that it's maybe useful for people to focus less on what are the jobs that are going to be created in 5 years, or what are the sectors that are going to be around in 10 years. Because if you think now to, I suppose, when I was in college, I finished my degree about 12 or 13 years ago, and some of the industries which were quite prominent then have certainly been relegated to the background. But a huge amount of industries which barely existed at that point have now become very, very prominent in our economy. So it's very difficult with the pace of change at the moment to predict exactly the type of jobs or sectors that will be there. So it's often better maybe to focus on what are the types of skills that are going to be in demand in a post-COVID world. And, so adaptability, emotional intelligence, digital skills. We know that regardless of the industries and regardless of the jobs, they're the type of skills that employers are going to be looking for years into the future.
And that's very interesting that you said that, because one of our previous interviews was with Jill Barrett, who is an employment coach, and she said exactly what you're saying then, that there are certain skills that are universal, kind of no matter what areas you're looking into. But it is true, I think, that certainly climate science and digital, the whole digital area are going to be huge, but as to what those positions are going to be, you know, we still don't fully know. And it as I ask some questions later, you brought up automation and people's worries, and that is something that's on a lot of young people's minds. But before that, I mean, we've spoken about growth careers. Would you see any careers that might see presenting less career opportunities in the future? Is there any that you would see that, you know, with the changes coming?
Well, I mean, I think that the same principle applies, that I suppose predicting the demise of certain sectors and occupations is probably too imperfect a science to kind of get too focused on. But I think if you look at the areas, you know, in terms of those transitions, if we are moving towards a more low carbon green economy, then I think it's a natural enough progression then to say that the jobs in high carbon intensive industries are likely to be eased out over that time period. Similarly, when we're talking about, you know, automation and we're talking about digital technology, roles like, you know, machine operators and roles in assembly line work, roles as telephone operators, a lot of roles that would fall into, I suppose, either the category of being maybe more dangerous manual labour or more menial monotonous work are probably among the more likely to be phased out over the period of the next 5 to 10 years, where a lot of those roles will become more and more automated or digitalised. Maybe the entire job isn't automated, but certainly, you know, the work is changed to a very, very significant degree. But a lot of that can have huge benefits for workers, where, you know, you'll be in a position where workers will be employed to oversee that technology rather than being the people who are carrying out the work that the technology can now do. Yeah,
so there'll be a change in the nature of that work, obviously. So, I mean, moving on from that, we often talk about the government creating jobs, and many of the young people we spoke to while we were preparing this event, that they want to make sure that it's not just that jobs are created, but that the jobs that are created are quality jobs. And so I want to ask you, what do you understand by this, by quality jobs, and what can we and unions do to ensure that the jobs created are quality? And we're talking about things like good pay and conditions, opportunities to advance, work-life balance is very important. So what would you see as quality jobs?
Well, I think you've touched on a few of what we would certainly in the trade union movement see over many, many years, many decades. You know, at the heart of the idea of trade unionism is the idea of providing quality, decent jobs to people, which are, you know, paid a fair wage, which have good security in their conditions, and which offer opportunities to advance. And I suppose the single biggest thing that we would see as being central to the provision of quality jobs into the future is the area of collective bargaining. And when we talk about collective bargaining, we're talking about employees having the right to be represented collectively in their workplace. There's huge amount of studies which would show that in jobs which have, you know, trade union membership, trade union recognition, and collective bargaining rights, where there's a negotiation not on an individual employee basis in terms of negotiating their contract with the employer, but with the whole collective of the workplace negotiating their terms and conditions, that they will be shown as jobs which are generally better paid, better security, better terms and conditions, and that kind of stability and a better share of the profit and the wealth that's created. You know, collective bargaining is essential to that. And some of the work that we're doing at the moment is looking at the fact that in Ireland, particularly within the private sector, collective bargaining coverage is quite weak. We're looking at about 40% of the country at the moment. Okay. That's much, much higher in the public sector, but in the private sector, so in a lot of these new industries we're talking about, in tech, in digital technology, you've got very low collective bargaining coverage or almost none. We see a situation in many European countries where that's 70, 80, 90%. And there's actually a new piece of legislation that's going through at the moment, an EU directive, which is calling on every country with collective bargaining coverage less than 70%, which would include Ireland, to take steps to get their coverage levels, to promote collective bargaining, to get their coverage levels up to that level or higher than that level. That would have a huge impact in terms of inequality, in terms of the type of jobs that we create, if we could ensure that there's a greater degree of collective bargaining, particularly within the private sector.
Okay, that's a very interesting angle that didn't occur to me as I was looking at it. It's true, I suppose, that the ability to collective bargain is going to, hopefully lead to higher quality positions. I'm going to move on to some questions now that were submitted to us by some young people who attend the Kerry Diocesan Youth Service. And we have questions from around the country. And they touch on some of the themes you've mentioned already. And there's a lot of concern about one thing, and that's automation. And what this person has said is automation is a growing concern for young people looking to their future, provided their interest maybe isn't in engineering, IT, or one of the growth areas we spoke about. Do you think any jobs around now will remain in 20 years? And will there be others that might be unrecognisable? So this is something you kind of touched on a little bit more. Is there anything you could add to that?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that to some level, the fears and the concerns about automation are real ones, because this is a transition that if we don't manage it properly and correctly, if you take the advent of the internet and what we've seen over the last 20 to 30 years, since the late 80s, early 90s, you would scarcely believe the kind of progress that we've made as a society, the kind of developments we've had in technology, productivity increases and so on. And over that same period of time globally, there's been a huge increase in inequality. Most of your listeners will be familiar with some of the political backlash we've seen in the UK with Brexit, in the US with the election of Donald Trump. A lot of that is down to the inequality that's been created through globalization, where people who maybe previously were in some of the jobs we spoke about in manufacturing and other areas where they had decent jobs, and because that transition of the internet globalization wasn't managed in a way where they were brought along with it. We've seen some very negative consequences from that. If you take, for example, average working hours of employees have pretty much stayed the same since the early 1980s in the Western world. We're working around 37 hours a week on average in the EU and in most Western world economies. The exact same as we were in the early to mid 80s. Whereas there's been a huge imbalance in terms of the sharing of the benefits of that between capital and between labour. And when we talk about labour, we're talking about workers and we're talking about employees. So we need to make sure that this transition is managed in a way where those benefits are shared in a much fairer way. So we're looking at the same report I mentioned earlier. It says that about 14% of jobs are likely to be automated, but actually around a third of jobs are at high risk of partial automation. So the whole job might not be automated, but certainly a part of it. And I suppose young people, because they're either just about to enter the workforce or they've only recently entered the workforce, are of course at a higher risk in some cases, because they don't have the same security, they maybe haven't got the same tenure built up that other people would do. So it is vitally important that we manage this transition in such a way that ensures that the fair sharing of the benefits of that, because there's going to be huge benefits for society and for the global economy off the back of that. So I suppose that's the somewhat cautionary note. Again, I would refer back to the fact that most of the studies in this area, another one that was done by McKinsey in 2011, found that the internet destroyed 500,000 jobs and created 1.2 million others. So, most of the major developments that we've seen throughout history have led to, of course you're going to be thinking about the work that might not be there tomorrow that's there today, but there's a lot of other areas that we know are likely to be developed as these changes are made in society.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I'm going to actually tell people looking at this, if they'd like to know more about that idea of a just transition, particularly when it comes to the climate and the European Green Deal. We actually did a series of interviews on the European Green Deal, and we had an economic advisor at the European Commission called Patrick O'Riordan who did a talk with me on that very subject, and it's well worth a watch. We might put the link on here, and he's speaking exactly about what you're speaking about there, that the transition will happen, certain jobs will be lost, but it's important that it's a just transition. and that, you know, new, maybe better jobs are created, and possibly to try and, he made the point that it should be seen as an opportunity rather than as a threat. So the next question concerns training, which was put to us by a young person who said that the length of training required to find a job has increased over time and become more expensive as a result. And if a continuous need to retrain emerges, do you think that training will be affordable, especially for student or people who are already in student debt? So what would you say to that?
Well, the first thing I'd say is it's a really, really good question, because I think this is such an important area. And if we are to do what I spoke about in terms of managing the transition, to do what you spoke about in terms of, you know, the just transition, this is one of the critical areas, because really what we're talking about in a lot of cases is that a lot of what would traditionally be called, and I hate this term, but low-skilled jobs, a lot of those types of jobs are the ones that are likely to be automated and to, you know, other jobs which are high carbon intensive are likely to go. And if they're going to be replaced by higher skilled jobs, then, you know, not just for young people, but for people who are much further down their careers, who've maybe done a particular role for 20, 30 years, all of a sudden that role is either, you know, replaced or is changed very significantly. How do we ensure that those people are supported within the workforce and within the labour market? And actually, I'm going to refer to a publication that I really would encourage people to take a look at. Our president, Michael D. Higgins, actually wrote a newspaper article last April on this, and you don't often see the president writing an article about a particular report, but it was done by the National Economic Social Council, and it was about addressing employment vulnerability as part of a just transition in Ireland. And they had one very specific ask, which I think is really, really important, which is that the state needs to play an increased role in terms of upskilling and retraining workers in occupations and sectors that are at risk of either being changed radically or displaced. And that could be either in the digital area or it could be in the carbon area. But basically what they say is that there should be an audit process to pinpoint what are the employments that are at risk, and once they have done that the state would fund training for those workers that are working in those sectors that they believe are at risk. That's a really, really pivotal aspect of this, because if we end up in a situation where, if you take I don't know if many of your listeners would be familiar with the situation in Tullamore or Pordenamona meat industry, you know, what's effectively happened there is that a decision's been made, which is understandable in the context of the climate crisis we're in, to effectively phase out that industry. And we're reacting. We are reacting by trying to address those workers' concerns when effectively they've already been told your jobs are on the way out. And we're trying to do it through subsidies and grants. Whereas if we had been proactive and identified this well in advance, which we can do, we know the types of jobs and industries that are going to be at risk. So if we can be proactive about it and plan for that and manage that change and provide these reskilling and retraining programs in advance, then we should be in a much better position to avoid the really unnecessary, you know, stress and burden that it places on those individual workers and families who are most affected.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And you've mentioned a number of studies and articles throughout this, so I might ask you actually after this to maybe send me some of those links, and I'll put them down below this video so that people can check them out themselves, because there's some really interesting things you've said there. I'm going to return now. Again, this question of automation just keeps coming up, but this is coming from a slightly different point of view, kind of a more ethical point of view. And this person says, do you think that certain jobs should be protected from automation? Currently, it's more common, obviously, in areas like manufacturing, which you've already mentioned, or in environments that are dangerous for humans, and you can see where automation is very useful there. However, if it becomes more cost effective to have, say, a robotic teacher or robotic nurse or police officer or librarian even, should this be allowed, they say? Or does it take too much power from our personal morals and ethics and put it in the hands of computer code? So it's coming from the automation kind of from an ethical point of view. What would you say about that?
Well, the short answer to should it be allowed, in my view, is no, for a few reasons. And I think your questioner has picked up on one of them. And the first thing I'd say is, you know, it's framed around the idea that if it's more cost effective to have a robot police officer than it is to have a human police officer then should we as a society or an economy take that decision? And I suppose if you take in the public service at the moment, so we're, as I said, a union that represents mostly public service workers. Every public service agreement that we enter into with the government, and we've actually just very recently negotiated a new public service agreement that you might have seen this week, is in the news, that's been balloted on and it's been accepted. There is a clause in that around outsourcing, which is that if work is going to be outsourced or if it's going to be privatised, it can't be done on a purely cost basis. So in other words, if there's an argument to be made to outsource the work because it can be done better or because it can be done more effectively, then that's a discussion that we're willing to enter into and willing to have. But if the idea is that work should be outsourced purely on the basis to effectively take what you described earlier as a quality job and to convert that into a lesser paid, more precarious, less secure job purely because it saves money, then we don't believe that that's an arrangement that we should consider at all. And I think that can be applied across society when we're dealing with automation. Just because something can be done cheaper by a robot doesn't mean that we should necessarily do it by a robot. It needs to be about, does this actually enhance the service? Does, automating and digitalizing this service free up humans to do other more high value work, which is a greater contribution to the public, to society? That's where we need to be on this question. What I would also say is most studies that I've read would suggest that actually what will happen when you talk about these caring roles, so nurses, teachers, home care people, people who work in elder care settings, people who work in child care settings, these are actually going to become more in demand and not less as a result of automation. These are the type of jobs that, because of, we spoke earlier about emotional intelligence, about some of those skills which really can't be automated, they're the type of things that people really value in those professions. If you want your loved ones to be looked after, if you want your child to be educated, you want it to be done by somebody where they have a degree of emotional intelligence, a connection with you, and I think that they're actually the type of employments which are probably among the safest from the transition that we're about to enter into.
Okay, that's interesting, and I suppose it's when we spoke earlier about growth careers, we immediately think of technology and climate, forgetting that maybe some of the more traditional human-centred careers are probably still just as important.
I think even there's another transition that we've just gone through and that we're still going through that is relevant here, and it's that I think the COVID pandemic has really made people revalue what's important in society. Have really made them revalue public service, key workers, frontline workers, this kind of, when we're talking about ethical and moral questions, the public good created by somebody who, sweeps the streets, the public good created by somebody who cares for your loved ones, and what they might be paid vis-a-vis a stockbroker who, might be a high-skilled job, but how much public good is created by the work that they're doing. I do think that people are moving into that space, so we need a re-evaluation of, how do we remunerate people based on the good that they create for society and not just the good that they create for shareholders or for profit. I think that's a very important ethical question.
Okay, very interesting. And again, I spoke about Patrick O'Riordan earlier, the economic advisor, and he spoke kind of in a similar way about maybe looking at a new way to measure the success of an economy, that maybe it shouldn't be just GDP, purely numbers, that we also have to look at quality of life. Quality of life and environmental impact should be, important. So you just mentioned COVID. So the last question I have is linked to that. We've obviously seen, right now we're seeing a huge increase in people working from home. Do you see working from home as something that's going to play a bigger role, even post-COVID? And kind of added to that, what do you think are maybe some of the advantages and disadvantages to that?
Well, I certainly think that there's no doubt that it's going to play a bigger role. I think that we are headed towards, in many, many industries and sectors, a situation where there is a hybrid or a blended approach whereby people will have the option to work from home for certain parts of the week and the potential to be in the office for other parts of the week. That seems to be the preference for an awful lot of people. That a lot of people aren't happy with 100% at home, but they don't necessarily want to be 100% in the office. I think that even from a competitive standpoint, that a huge amount of companies will find it difficult as we emerge from this pandemic not to offer some kind of blended or hybrid approach to their employees. Our experience at Forsa, we did one of the biggest surveys on remote working. We had over 5,000 respondents this year, and generally our members, there is an appetite, there is a demand for having access to options for remote working beyond the pandemic. But I think there's a few cautionary points that need to be made. The first is that if we were to negotiate the kind of huge transition that we've seen to people all of a sudden waking up one morning and they're working from home, and many of us have been working from home now for almost a year full time, we would, as trade unions and as government and as society, have negotiated, well, what does this look like? What's the deal that we put in place? What protections do we need to have in place for workers? What changes do we need to make to employment law to make sure that people are supported and that their rights are vindicated? We obviously didn't have the opportunity to do that. This was a big bang change that was forced on us by a deadly pandemic. So in many ways, we're now we're trying to build the airplane while it's in flight. We're trying to to resolve some of these matters as we go. But it is vitally important, as one example, that we don't have a situation where people don't have the right to disconnect, where people end up, when they're working from home, that they're on the clock night, noon and morning, that they're expected to be available all day, every day. And obviously the stresses that places on people, that at least in an office setting, while people might have felt that there was a natural construct around when they were available and when they weren't, a lot of people are experiencing that that's not the case now. We need to deal with that in terms of legislation. We need to deal with...
And I know the French have recently brought in a law on that, the right to disconnect, as you say.
And the government here in Ireland are currently looking at it as well. Okay. So that's a very important area. The other thing that was brought up I think in the question was around some of the disadvantages that we've experienced, is that actually it's young people, while the majority of young people are still favourable towards remote working, it's a smaller majority than the rest of the workforce. And that's mainly for two reasons. The first is that young people are generally, for obvious reasons, early in their career, they're early in that particular profession, and they find that it's more difficult to learn on the job, they find it's more difficult to progress, maybe to make an impact with their superiors, because they're working from home. The second issue is that young people generally tend to value the social aspect of work to a higher degree. So those regular day-to-day interactions with colleagues. So we do certainly see that there are very much, for a lot of young people, there are negatives. There are some young people who, because of their housing situation, don't have adequate workspaces, are really in cramped apartments and rental properties. So these are all issues that, if remote working is going to stay and be a feature of our society in the long term, which I think it probably will be, then we're going to need to make sure that those kinds of things are provided for, and that provision is made for, people's work from home equipment, people's right to disconnect, and also making sure that young people aren't disadvantaged by the fact that they don't have the same access to learn from colleagues that maybe they would do when they'd be in the office.
I mean, and there's obviously, a lot of advantages, and environmental as well, less traffic on the roads, less office space, but it's true that we really have to, make sure we're ready for this, and that people can switch off and they can separate their home from their work life, which as I know and you know and everyone else knows at the moment, that's not always the easiest thing to do. So on that, Joe, thank you very much. That was really interesting. We covered a lot of ground there, and thanks especially for answering the questions that the various young people around the country submitted to us. You gave really interesting answers and gave us a lot to think about. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks for the invite, and thanks for the great questions. Really enjoyed it.
Okay, me too. Bye-bye.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.